I grew up in Saskatchewan, didn't grow up in a Bible-believing church, didn't grow up in a Christian home, not really hearing the gospel till I was 24 years old. The area where I grew up, you would have to drive an hour any direction and you wouldn't find a Bible-believing church. When you start talking statistically, there's a small number of gospel-believing Christians in this country. And there's whole areas where there's no Bible-believing church at all. Hi, I'm Murray McClellan, one of the pastors in Grace Fellowship in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada. Saskatoon is where I went to university, became a phys ed teacher, and that's what I was doing in a village north of Saskatoon, where we now are, happily going through life, and God decided to interrupt that, and glad that He did. The first Christian that I was really aware of was this farmer who was the parent of one of the girls in my class. He's the one that would steer conversation to spiritual things. And so he basically said, if this bus was to crash and you were to die, what would happen to you? And at that point, looking back, I realized now it was the very Spirit of God. And so grace was exceedingly sweet when 3 weeks later, the church planter of a town just nearby, he and his wife ended up at our house. And God just used that moment in time to open my eyes to the reality of who He is and who Jesus was. I'm just so thankful that we were saved into this new church plant. And what was really cool about this little church plant is that I would say out of the first 24 people, there were really only 3 that had grown up in church. It was only about 3 months in my Christian faith, and the church planter asked me if I would consider meeting with him on Saturday mornings for being equipped and trained. So we began meeting at his home every Saturday, and we'd have an hour of systematic theology, a study in a book of the Bible, and he started teaching me Greek. I was trained then by the pastor, the church planter, just within the context of the local church. So in time, God actually had us move to Alberta. And then in a strange way God works, He actually brought us back to Saskatchewan, back to Leask, which was the very town where the church plant was, and which God saved me, and my wife in the meantime had come to faith in Jesus as well. And this time it was called back now to pastor the very church that I was saved in. We had what we called an evening of theology in the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, our province's largest city. During that time, God in His grace had a number of people make professions of faith in Jesus. And so that led us to be intentional then about actually starting a church in Saskatoon. We knew we just couldn't do this alone, and so we began to look at who could we maybe partner with to see the gospel really advance in our city and beyond into places in our province. With our theological convictions, with the mission we felt we were called to, with our understanding of what is the church and what the church's purpose really is for, we just felt in every case we'd have to compromise something or an area. And then God in His grace connected us with this global network called Acts 29, and began looking at that and began making connections, and I learned about the network and as the more we dug in, we realized, this is home. This fits who we are, with no compromise, that we really did feel, we're part of Acts 29. And this allows us to be part of something so much greater than ourselves. In those early days, the network was just a huge blessing and a catalyst to keep us centered on the gospel, keep us really focused on the mission that Jesus had for His church. That being poured into by these brothers is what's really helped keeping me stirred up for the gospel, stirred up for the mission of Jesus. It's just been indispensable, really, this relationship that we've had as a part of Acts 29.
And we had big dreams to church plant downtown and be a church for the city that planted multiple churches throughout the province. But the truth was, we didn't have a lot of up-and-coming leaders. Clay Bittner and I, we were interns together.
I just love that Murray intentionally took the time to disciple these 2 young guys who really didn't know what we were doing. But by God's grace, He saw in us a passion for the gospel, and He wanted to stir that up in us and train us to become pastors and church planters.
We gathered just a number of different young guys, started to pour into them the same way that that church planter had first poured into me. And in His grace, God just allowed us to grow and have people meet Jesus and people baptized. And what we now call gospel communities, as families of missionaries really in our own culture, continuing to take the gospel outward. And then we launched meeting in a movie theater downtown in January 2011.
2015, as the church in Saskatoon continued to grow, after a lot of prayer and discernment, we planted in the small city of Warman, which is just north of Saskatoon.
It was decided that Clay and Kim would plant Grace Warman along with Alicia and I, and so that's how Grace Warman came to be.
And so that became then our first plant out of our church plant. And then more recently, we've planted a new area of Saskatoon.
In September of 2019, we were sent out from Grace Saskatoon. There's a core group of us, so with the Whitehawks.
I love that our vision is to continue to plant churches. We don't want to grow stagnant or become complacent. We want to continue to plant churches and make disciples so that more people like myself, many people in First Nations communities around the province would hear the gospel and have a gospel-centered church in their area. And so that's what we want to be a part of as Grace Fellowship.
That's our heart. We want to continue to see where there's a need. And there's other places in this city, new areas of the city, where there's, maybe 30,000 people in a community with no gospel-centered church. And so the needs here in our province are great. And we know we can't do everything, but we can continue to just keep being faithful, teaching the word, making disciples, and hopefully continue just to reproduce and multiply for the fame and glory of the one who has given himself for us.